The most dangerous prison in the world is located in Brazil. This is a place where inmates live by their own rules and wardens do and even try to stop them from breaking out. But why and how did this prison become so overcrowded that the police simply can't keep control over it? This is the story of one of the most insane prisons in the world, Salvador, Cecil. The story of this prison begins in the early 20th century when Brazil decided they needed more space for their inmates. So they turned to the small town of Santa Maria da Boa Vista, which at the time only had about 400 residents. The city council agreed to let the government use some land outside of town to build a prison. It was perfect because it was far enough away from the rest of civilization that any noise coming from the prison wouldn't be heard. It was also cheap and easy to defend in case an inmate tried to escape. So construction began on what would become one of the biggest prisons in Brazil. By 1932, the prison was finished and it was named the Special Prison for the Condemned of the State of Bahia, or PSEM for short. The prison was built to hold just under 1,000 prisoners, but from the very beginning, there were problems. When the first inmates arrived, they quickly found out that the prison was barely guarded. In fact, many of the guards knew the inmates and their families, and they often let them bring contraband into the prison in exchange for money. This meant that when the prisoners arrived, they were given things like knives, drugs, and guns, which caused all sorts of problems, including a riot after just 2 weeks of the prison being open. This riot ended with several inmates stabbed and one guard beaten so badly he died. But instead of increasing security, the government actually decreased it, believing that if the inmates weren't provoked, they wouldn't cause trouble. This led to a number of inmates escaping, which resulted in the government having to increase security once again, but the damage was already done. Prisoners realized that if they worked together, they could easily overpower the guards and do whatever they wanted. So they began organizing themselves into gangs. In the next few years, gang violence got worse and worse until finally the government intervened and broke up the gangs. But this only led to even more violence between the inmates and the guards. In 1948, a riot broke out and didn't end until 160 soldiers showed up with orders to shoot anyone who didn't comply. This led to over 100 inmates being killed, which was the turning point for PSEM. After this, the government promised to improve conditions and decrease violence. And to a certain extent, they kept their promise. Life inside the prison was still tough, but violence between inmates and guards decreased. That is until 1983. In 1983, the violence started up again, and soon the prison was controlled by the inmates. They took over the kitchens and began cooking their own food, and they set up their own system of guards and wardens. Since then, this prison has been known as the most dangerous prison in the world, and it has actually never been retaken by the Brazilian government. In fact, the government has largely given up on trying to retake it. Instead, they've let the inmates essentially run it themselves. But why is the government doing this? Well, one reason is because it's just easier than trying to stop them. There aren't that many guards compared to the inmates, so it would be almost impossible to retake the prison by force. Another reason is because the inmates have created a functional society that keeps order and peace amongst themselves. If the Brazilian government was to retake the prison, it is likely that the level of violence would skyrocket and innocent inmates would be caught in the crossfire. And since the inmates are able to control the prison, there isn't much violence anymore. And this is another reason why the government lets them run it. If the government tries to get involved, it'll lead to violence, which will endanger the inmates. If they stay out of the prison, it's likely that the inmates will be able to keep each other in line. But what is life like inside this prison? Well, like I said, it's not great, but it's also not terrible. You see, despite being extremely overcrowded and having terrible sanitation, the inmates are able to make their own food and they're able to protect themselves. In fact, the inmates have created their own form of currency called fiches, which they use to buy things from each other and even the prison guards. Inmates are able to make these fitches by working in the prison doing things like laundry or cleaning the cells. Fitches are used to buy things like drugs, cigarettes, alcohol, cell phones, TVS, food, and even weapons. Speaking of weapons, inmates often make their own weapons out of everyday items such as razor blades, toothbrushes, and bed sheets. The weapons they create can be deadly, such as shivs made out of razor blades and bed sheets that can be used to hang someone. Also, despite the prison being completely overcrowded, it's rumored that certain cells have TVS and refrigerators. And yeah, that's kind of crazy because of the amount of violence that happened in the past. Inmates will often band together for protection. Most inmates belong to one of four groups: the leopards, the horses, the dogs, and the eagles. If you want to join one of these groups, you basically have to ask to join and hope they accept you. But these groups don't exist just for protection. They also help inmates get access to the things they need to survive in the prison. For example, if you want a TV in your cell, it's likely that you'll have to pay a member of one of these groups. Now, even though this prison seems to be able to take care of itself, the government does intervene sometimes. When an inmate dies, the government sends a forensic team to investigate. They also send in doctors to check up on the inmates every now and then. And occasionally, they'll do a sweep of the prison to find contraband. However, these visits are rare, and most of the time, the government stays out of Saco. It's reported that the government has tried to retake the prison multiple times, but each attempt ends in failure. The inmates are just too prepared, and the Brazilian government doesn't want to risk the lives of their soldiers or the inmates. Today, this prison is home to just under 7,000 inmates. And even though it was only built to hold 900, it's a lot less crowded than it was in the 1980s. This is because in the 1990s, 3 other prisons were built in the area to specifically hold inmates that were sent from Pech. Even though there are other prisons available, inmates don't want to leave Pech. You see, in Brazil, a transfer from Peaks means you'll probably never see your family again. And this is because the government usually sends inmates from Peaks to remote prisons in the Amazon jungle. So even though life in Peaks is difficult, it's still better than life in one of those prisons. So what's next for the most dangerous prison in the world? Well, recently, the government has been trying to work with the inmates to give them more rights and make their lives better. In return, the inmates have agreed to allow the government to take back the prison little by little. However, this process is going very slowly because the inmates don't want to lose the freedom they've grown accustomed to. Only time will tell if the government is able to retake this prison. But one thing is for sure, it'll be a long and difficult process. And on that note, this has been the most dangerous prison in the world. And if you liked this video, please subscribe. Thanks for watching.